Worldwide movement, peace, love, respect. Big King Sadiq hollering at you one more again. All right, we're gonna make this a quick one for sure, as it is pretty late in the day, and we're out, and visibility obviously low, but an important one indeed. We call this generational blame. All right, so there is in some of my previous videos, I've given mention to the unfortunate experience I've had of witnessing the tendency to sort of blame all that is wrong in society, particularly quote unquote in the hood, right? To blame that blindly, just about as blind as you would be trying to look at me right now. To blame that blindly on the young folks, right? Don't get me wrong. You know, I was young, and a large part of that pretty mischievous, right? Got into a lot of things that, you know, at a later age, you look back on like, well, you know, that wasn't smart, or wasn't wise, or wasn't the right thing to do. In retrospect, in hindsight, as they say, right? But you know, they all say hindsight. Also say hindsight is 20/20. So, what's meant by that is, you know, it's pretty easy to look back on things having the benefit of experience, and then sort of wanting to have a revisionist history, as they say. But the reality is that, you know, particularly today, young people definitely get a bad rap anytime that they're being blamed for how bad things are, right? Particularly the inner city youth who get blamed so often and so falsely portrayed in an extremely ugly manner by the media, right? Particularly the news networks. And we already talked about who they're controlled by, right? But yeah, you know, unfortunately, this is a very normalized thing, right? And people buy into it, which I think is what I had expressed before is the sad aspect, is that people do buy into it. And, you know, unfortunately, what that looks like is them having a very blanket approach to how they view things that they are quick to place judgment on young people for, like things they see in the news, right? Without really taking into account all the things that factor into that situation, right? And in general, all the situations that, or most of the situations at least, that young folks find themselves getting into. You know, I'm talking about socioeconomic factors, you know, peer pressure, which I think gets undervalued and underlooked in terms of how it factors into a lot of this. And essentially, it's about pointing the finger. Because, well, why do people point the finger in any situation? Because they're looking to assess blame. Well, why do they want to assess blame? Well, people want to assess blame so they can point the finger, say, oh, it's their fault, or it's this person's fault or that person's fault, and unfortunately follow the typical course which the society has taught us to adopt, which is punish, and then that makes everybody feel better, right? You know, it's a whole nother video to get into talking about our penal system and why it doesn't work. It's not designed to work. It's designed actually to do just what it does, create a cycle of a revolving door of folks going in and out of these facilities. But that's, again, a whole nother video. As this pertains to young folks, again, they get the blame in a lot of this when most of these factors, right? Most of these factors, they have absolutely no control over or input on or impact on, right? So that's disappointing. But I've expressed that. I think I wanted to go a little bit more into it in terms of why, right? Why do we rush to do that? Well, I think that older generations are very quick to get drawn into the trappings of, wow, this is how life is supposed to be, because they've lived some life, some life experiences, and hopefully learned and benefited from experience. And now that they've got it right, it's kind of like, and this is often on the subconscious level, but it's kind of like, oh, I'm Mr. Know-It-All. And really, folks, that's what we do. And we don't intend to often, particularly when we're talking to folks that are younger than us. We may be intending that, well, my advice is exactly what they need because they can benefit from my experience. And theoretically, that's how it should work. But what ends up happening is, instead of us just sharing our experiences, right, and letting them benefit from that by saying, hey, this is what happened to me. This is what I did. This is a situation I ran into. And letting them draw their own conclusions, right? You can certainly share with them, hey, this is the lesson that I learned from that, right? This is how my life was impacted. If I had an opportunity to do it differently, I would do it this way. But instead, what we end up doing is saying, you should do this. You should do that. You gotta do this. You gotta do that. If you want to have a good life, you'll do it this way. If you know what's good for you, you'll do it this way. Listen to me, I know what's best for you. Do it like this. Or often, unfortunately, and I've been guilty of this, my children will tell you, just do what I say because I'm the parent and you don't need an explanation. Just do it just because I said so. Now, don't get me wrong. There's some situations where that does apply. Child's about to run into the street, there's a car coming. We don't have time to debate it. You need to get your little butt out of the street, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. Certainly more complex things that we could take the time to discuss and explain things. And rather than just explain things, converse with our children. There's a different thought, right? Actually converse with our children about how they feel or view a given situation. And then again, lend our experience to them. And if we do that and do it from that safe of a place, right? For young folks, I think they'll be a lot more receptive of what we're offering to them because, for one, again, we're giving them a safe enough place to accept it. We're not backing them up against the wall saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. We're essentially saying, if I were you, right, or back when I was in similar shoes as you were in, here's what I did. Here's how it impacted me. Here's what I do differently, right? You know? And I just think that's a much healthier and more beneficial way to approach it. And yeah, so unfortunately, the blame game gets played by us, particularly in the direction of our young folks, for sort of a not a good reason, but an understandable reason, right? Largely because when an older generation points the finger at a younger generation saying you're the cause of things being so messed up, you know, I've heard people say, like, throw this whole generation away type statements, you know, and particularly I'm gonna say this is said about young people of color and inner city young folks, right? And that's a shame that people are really, really, really quick to say that about them because they suffer from the most factors that are out of their control, whether it be socioeconomic, whether it be direct attacks, right, that are aimed at them through social engineering, right? And again, if you don't know anything about that, that's another video that I have you can check into, and there's certainly a lot more information on it than that. But yeah, they have to deal with a lot, you know, and just imagine just the fact of them growing up in this world, right? You know, I think back when I was coming up, and we were, when I say we, I guess I'm saying my generation, we were the generation that got introduced to quote unquote gang banging on a national perspective, right? You know, it always been heard about in other cities, and we had always had, even here in Pittsburgh, different territorial clashes, right? Between different areas of the city. But in the 90s, I think all over the nation in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, it took on a different face, right? With the spreading of the Crips and Bloods organizations, which unfortunately a lot of people who took that on didn't really understand and know much of anything about how those organizations even started, but that's a whole nother video. But yeah, in the 90s, it got really rough. And I know because that was the time I was coming up out there in the street, right? And running out of my mind, doing out of my mind sorts of things. And quite frankly, kind of a violent person, right? And but that's another video too. uh, but you know, just as I've come a long way, and a lot of folks come a long way, these young folks who make some mistakes will come a long way too, given a chance, right? Um, in spite of all that they face and how difficult it is to grow up in this world, right? It was bad enough in the 90s, like I said, with gang violence coming and all that, but now, not only do you still have different versions of all that, you you essentially, I'm not going to even get into a summary of what all we're facing now, but we know how desperate the world situation appears to be. So imagine what it could be like for a young person growing up, right? But yet and still, that finger tends to get pointed in their direction, that finger of blame. And it is because the older generation, when they look at the younger generation, are unfortunately in their minds subconsciously reminded of areas that they feel like they failed them, right? Failed them in preparing them for the world in which they live, right? And to some degree that may be true. Nobody's infallible. We make mistakes. Parents make mistakes, right? And this can be expressed even on a generational level, right? You know, each generation of parents can look back if they were sitting around in a circle and likely say, oh man, you know, we really dropped the ball when we did this, or we really, you know, I regret the fact that we allowed this to happen, you know, on our watch, sort of a thing. And all that's valid. But again, like I said, nobody's perfect. Parents certainly make mistakes. And this, again, can happen on a generational level. But when they look at young folks, particularly the negative way that they're portrayed, you know, like I said, in the media, etc., they're reminded of these things. And that's unsettling. That's unsettling, folks. That's the truth of it. If we want to look, listen, I said many times that a big part of this, a huge part of this, is us being spiritually mature enough to look at ourselves in the mirror and be honest about what things simply have to change about us and this paradigm that we had allowed to come into existence, had been tricked into coming into existence, right? And what that actually looked like on a day-to-day basis in our lives, right? Particularly how we interacted with our young folks. And that's sort of an explanation of the psychology, a brief, you know, brief snapshot of one of the main reasons why older generations tend to look down on or point the finger at younger generations. Because, again, subconsciously it's nipping at them, oh, look, they're doing this, they're doing that. You know, when really in the back of their mind they're saying, dang, I didn't teach them to not do that. You know, we didn't raise them to do this or to do that, you know. But in reality, again, they feel like they failed in that mission. Subconsciously, largely. Some, in general, will sort of admit that, right? I'm kind of that that type of individual for my generation. Now, I don't know if I've ever been on the bandwagon of blaming things on young folks. If I was wrong, right? Now, also, I want to say quickly that swings both ways. The younger generation always has, or often has, a tendency to look at the world and say, oh man, y'all effed up this world and then leave it to us to fix. Well, yeah, the generation before you could say that of the generation before them, and on and on and on and on. But in reality, they're just people who made mistakes, right? Everybody's going to make mistakes. And again, we can look at this even on a generational level. So that swings both ways. You know, I think why it's important for us to identify it, and so we can process it and move past it, right? Again, that's the process that we're going through in this. It's you should hear a repetitive theme coming from me. We identify something, right, so that we can process it, process the fact that it needs to change, what needs to change about it, and what action we need to take in order to make that change come to fruition, right? And then once we've identified that action, then actually carrying it out. And then certainly from those seeds that we sow, we'll reap the rewards, right? But this is the process. We've got to go through the process. And the more that we do complete that process effectively, right, the more we will see us being in a position to reap the rewards of those seeds that have been sown. Okay? So, yeah, that tendency for generations to blame one another, particularly we often see it happen with the older generation pointing the finger at the younger generation. But again, it can swing both ways. And looking at that, in summary, we have to realize that is a point of division. Just like I talked previously a little bit about the division between sexes, right? Between men and women. But I'll probably be doing another video getting into that a little deeper as well. But yeah, there's a larger picture that we have to keep our eyes focused on, right? Remember, we were talking about the difference between unity consciousness and separation mentality. And in order for us to truly and fully bring about this new paradigm, we've already done the huge thing, right, which is we've ushered it in with our intent. But now we've got to cement it, right, with our action, with our visualization, with our conceptualizing, but most importantly, with our deep cognizing of it, right? And the way that we do that is we've got to put in the work. Hey, folks, there's no way of getting around work. Work can take on many different forms. I just think it's important we do work that's worthwhile, and certainly this is work that is worthwhile. So what we have got to do, there we go again, what I would recommend we do, is really take a honest and rigorous look at these things that are creating and causing this separation mentality, right? Because this is the tool, the largest tool that the socioeconomic elites have utilized in being able to control the masses, right? The number one product of their social engineering devices, right, is the production of a fear society that is very much fed by mentalities that are dominated by separation, right? The separation mentality, viewing everything as apart from yourself and not of consequence to you, right? When in fact all things are interrelated, right? So let's not fall into the separation mentality of pointing the finger at the other generation, and let's benefit from one another, right? Um, Younger generations, you can benefit from the wisdom and the experiences of folks who have lived similar situations before you. That only makes sense, right? Um, Older generations never lose sight or forget the fact that that is literally the future you're talking to there when you talk to somebody younger than you. As of right now, we don't have a means of turning back time. We cannot, as much as we like that revisionist history, we can't go back and revise anything. But that young person in front of you has a whole lot of life yet to live and some very impactful years that can go a long way toward molding a better paradigm, right? So always remember, cherish, honor, and respect them in that regard. And as long as we're doing that, young folks honoring, respecting, and valuing, right, the older generation, and the older generation respecting, honoring, cherishing, and viewing the younger generation as truly their future. Hey man, we can't lose. That's honestly, that's the truth of it. If we do it like that, in my opinion, we can't lose. We can't lose. And we already done won, but we still got work. What's that old Isley, but I got work to do. I got a job, baby. I got work to do. We know I can't sing. I'll tap that mic on the lyrical skills, but we know I can't sing. But y'all get the point. No falling for separation mentality. We're going to continue to bring about unity consciousness. We're going to bring the generations together, and we're going to all benefit immensely from that. So let's all come together, right? And forward. Let's move forward. To what? You know the what. To worldwide movement. Peace, love, respect. Big King Sadiq. I'm out.